Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so today we're diving straight into how the absolutely chaotic, ancient city of Corinth directly shaped the incredible dysfunctions of the early Christian church. You know, if you've ever wondered how our surrounding environment influences the way we behave and believe, this source material offers a truly fascinating and honestly kind of shocking case study. We're going to unpack the historical, geographical, and cultural context of 1 Corinthians to figure out exactly why the Apostle Paul was essentially pulling his hair out trying to guide this specific community.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. The geography of Corinth. 2. A culture of vice. 3. Scandals in the sanctuary. 4. Navigating Christian liberty. 5. Marriage in a crisis. And 6. The tension of grace.
All right, Section 1, the geography of Corinth, the Vegas of antiquity. Now think about the number 4.5 for a second. That is the exact length, in miles, of the land bridge, the isthmus, where Corinth was located. See, back in the ancient world, sailing all the way around the southern tip of Greece was incredibly dangerous. It was this terrifying 200-mile detour. So instead, sailors would bring their ships into port, and if the boat was small enough, they would literally haul the entire thing on carts right across that 4.5-mile strip of land. No joke! Larger boats would just unload their cargo, carry it across, and reload on the other side. This insane geographical shortcut completely flooded the city with massive trade, transient sailors, and astronomical wealth.
This location was such a crucial shortcut that even after the Romans utterly destroyed the city in 146 BC, it only sat empty for a century. Julius Caesar took one look at it and essentially said, yeah, this spot is way too good to waste, and repopulated it with Roman soldiers in 46 BC. The terrain there was so brutally rocky that they couldn't even blast a canal through it until 1890. So for centuries, this grueling manual labor of hauling cargo is what defined the city. You've got massive wealth, endless streams of foreign sailors passing through, and a culture built entirely around transient commerce.
Moving right along to Section 2, a culture of vice, where commerce meets chaos.
You know a city has a wild reputation when its actual name becomes a verb for debauchery. The term to Corinthianize was widely used in antiquity, and it literally meant to act like a Corinthian, to engage in prostitution or gross immorality. This place was the headquarters for the worship of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The local culture was just thoroughly steeped in permissiveness, which, as you can guess, made it an incredibly difficult place to establish any sort of rigid, morally upright community.
Which brings us to Section 3, Scandals in the Sanctuary. The culture bleeds in.
The absolute crucial point to grasp here is that the early Christian church didn't transform the city transformed the church. Paul spent a year and a half planting this congregation, but the second he left, that Vegas-like culture came flooding right through the church doors. First up, we see this through intense, bitter factions. Instead of unity, you had members treating their spiritual leaders like rival celebrities. Groups were proudly shouting, "Well, I follow Paul," while others yelled back, "I follow Apollos." It was a full-blown personality cult driven by spiritual arrogance. They were treating the church exactly like the status-driven markets and philosophical debate clubs out in the streets.
Paul actually hits back at this spiritual arrogance with some really biting sarcasm. He essentially acts as a fool, mocking their inflated egos. So he's like, oh, sure, look at us poor apostles. We're just condemned spectacles dying in the arena. But you Corinthians, wow, you are so incredibly wise. He uses this deep sarcasm to highlight their human pride, trying to wake them up to the fact that they are acting entirely worldly, not spiritual at all.
And it gets worse. The culture bled so deeply into the sanctuary that it totally corrupted their most sacred practices. When they gathered for the Lord's Supper, the wealthy members, who of course controlled the schedule and the food, were rushing ahead. They were literally chowing down, overeating, and getting drunk on the communion wine. Meanwhile, the poorer members and slaves, who had to arrive later, were left sitting there hungry. They took a profound moment of unity and warped it into a mirror of the city's selfish, class-divided gluttony.
Then there's the scandal that even the pagan locals found completely repulsive. A man in the congregation was sleeping with his stepmother. And the wildest part? The church was actually patting themselves on the back for being so tolerant and open-minded about it. Paul is absolutely horrified. He tells them to kick the man out of the fellowship immediately, hand him over to Satan, as he puts it, so that this destructive behavior is stopped and the man's spirit might ultimately be saved.
On top of all that, you had believers dragging each other into secular courts over petty squabbles. Instead of handling their internal disputes with grace and wisdom, they were suing each other just to get a piece of that Corinthian wealth. Paul argues that they are completely failing the test of community here. He asks a pretty jarring question. Shouldn't you rather just be wronged? Shouldn't you just take the loss rather than air out all your dirty laundry in front of a city that already mocks you?
Okay, Section 4, Navigating Christian Liberty. Rights versus responsibilities.
Paul steps in to tackle a massive hot-button issue for them: eating meat sacrificed to idols. In a city packed with pagan temples, the absolute best steaks in town were the leftovers from those sacrifices. Now, Paul actually agrees with the smart theological minds in Corinth. He says, yes, idols are fake, they're nothing. Meat is just meat. Technically, you have the absolute right to eat it, but here is the kicker. If eating that meat in front of a newer believer causes them to stumble because they still associate it with demonic worship, then your freedom has become destructive. Paul's radical conclusion is that true Christian maturity isn't about flexing your rights to the absolute maximum, it's about voluntarily giving up those rights out of love for someone else.
Let's look at Section 5, Marriage in a Crisis. Navigating relationships in chaos.
Paul gets hyper-practical here, fielding specific questions they mailed to him. Remember, navigating sexual ethics in this hyper-sexualized city was unbelievably tough. Paul brings a lot of nuance, offering advice and concessions rather than strict, unbending commands. He says, look, to avoid rampant immorality right outside your doors, it is totally fine and good to marry. However, he personally advises that singleness might actually be better because of the present crisis. Whether that was local persecution, a famine, or just impending hostility, he knew marriage brought worldly troubles he wanted to spare them from. He also offers this beautiful grace for divided homes. If you become a believer but your spouse doesn't, don't just abandon them. Stay, be a light, and let your faith sanctify that household.
And finally, Section 6, the tension of grace, vice, value, and washing.
We reach the climax of Paul's letter here, and it wrestles with a huge question. How do you confront a culture of deep vice without crushing the people trapped inside it? Think of his theology of the body like this. If you buy cheap plastic pearls from a dollar store, you might toss them around, hand them to anyone, and not really care what happens to them. But if you have diamonds from Fifth Avenue, you guard those. You treat them with immense respect. Paul is telling the Corinthians they're treating their bodies like dollar store items. But in reality, their bodies are temples. They are Fifth Avenue diamonds bought at the highest conceivable price, the blood of Jesus.
After brutally listing out the absolute worst vices of the city, reminding them that idolaters, drunkards, swindlers, and the sexually immoral will not inherit the kingdom, Paul delivers this breathtaking pivot. He looks at this messy, chaotic, deeply flawed congregation and says, and that is what some of you were. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified. He doesn't minimize their terrible pasts for a second, but he completely magnifies the overwhelming power of their cleansing.
So wrapping up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final striking tension. How do we honor the incredible value of our bodies and hold the line on virtue while remaining agents of profound washing grace? The Corinthians struggled so deeply to balance the truth of their new identity with the powerful magnetic pull of their old city. It's a mirror for our own times, really. It challenges us to look at exactly where our surrounding culture is bleeding into our own lives and asks us the hard question: are we willing to surrender our personal rights for the sake of radical, restorative love?